Risks, what threat? Nuclear weapons 80 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We appreciate the grateful support of the McFarland Center for the study of religion, ethics, and culture to provide the funds to bring our esteemed panelists to Holy Cross today. Our conversation will be recorded and posted on YouTube in coming days, so if you miss an insight, fear not. There will be an opportunity to go back and revisit this conversation. Given the delays, I will abbreviate my introduction and framing of the conversation, but essentially, 80 years ago, on August 6, 1945, and then on August 9th, 1945, the United States deployed the only wartime use of nuclear weapons that the world has seen, not to mention the history of testing that came after, or preceded that attack and came after. And 80 years after this year, there were global commemorations of the anniversary in Worcester, of the anniversary. Here in Worcester, the Hiroshima Commemoration Project, which is sitting in the crowd, held an event on the banks of Lake Quinsigamon. In Hiroshima, the annual Hiroshima Peace Memorial Ceremony took place, and from the United States, attendees or pilgrims, to use the theological term, went to Hiroshima with a delegation of 4 Catholic bishops, several academics, and some college students from colleges and universities across the world. So here at Holy Cross, we stop and think about what are the implications of nuclear weapons in our present moment. They are not a relic of the Cold War. Rather, they are still present in rising tensions between the United States, Russia, and China, where the existence of Iran's nuclear program justifies an attack from the U.S., as you might have heard of over the summer, where the U.S. is modernizing its nuclear arsenal to the tune of $946 billion, which is an estimate that continues to increase by the year, in a world where the late Pope Francis declared the possession of nuclear weapons for the purpose of deterrence as immoral. And also, just this morning, in his speech to the UN, President Trump named that he wanted a cessation of the development of nuclear weapons, amongst other horrendous things. So in any case, we are here to stop, to think, and to hear from a great panel to think about what nuclear weapons mean 80 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I will read all of their bios. They will, and then we will invite each of them up. Or I'll invite the first one up, and then we'll interrupt. So how the program will go is that there'll be about 15 minutes per speaker to introduce what they're talking and thinking about. And then we will have a thematic discussion of questions that we've prepared, and then we will turn it over to the audience for any questions that you might have at the end. Okay. First we have Mariah Gomez. She is currently an associate professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico, where she directs the study abroad program in Caracas, Spain. Mariah is also the author of Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, Colonialism and the Effects of the Nuclear Industrial Complex on Nuevo Mexicanos, which was awarded a Southwest Book Award and was an International Latino Book Award. So welcome, Mariah.
Santas y buenas tardes. Thank you, Jacques, for inviting me here today. It's really a pleasure to be here with 2 people whose work is just incredibly important, and with all of you here at Holy Cross today. So what I'd like to do for the sake of time, there's so much I want to talk about, and I'm going to condense it really quickly. But I'm really trying to target this talk to the students who are here today. So what I want to focus on is talking a little bit about where New Mexico fits into the conversation about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is to say that New Mexico was also bombed in 1945. and then thinking about where that puts us in 2025, 80 years later. I often get asked by students how I entered into this work. The photo on the left is of my great-grandparents, Jose Maria and Delfinia Serna, who were evicted from their ranch in 1942 when the federal government came into Los Alamos, or the Pajarito Plateau, in northern New Mexico to start the Manhattan Project. There were over 36 Nuevo Mexicano, that's to say Hispanic or Mexican-American ranching and farming families who were displaced from their ranches. And when we hear about New Mexico, how many of you watched Oppenheimer, watched the film? You don't see any locals in that film. New Mexico continues 80 years later to be depicted as remote and uninhabited and uninhabitable in 1945, which is not the case. The photo on the right is of my grandfather, not their son, obviously, but my grandfather, Ramon Gomez Sr., who was a laborer during the Manhattan Project, and he and his brothers who worked there subsequently died of cancer, we believe, because they were overexposed to radiation, which is the story that is very common in my community. In fact, last week I met a girl who's a few years younger than me who was at an event. She came up to me afterwards. We met for coffee, and she was telling me about the 3 members of her family who've subsequently died of cancer. This is a map just to think about the bombings themselves from 1945. When those of you who know the story, I mean, I'll go through it really quickly, which is that the first bomb, the first plutonium bomb, I should say, was tested in southern New Mexico on July 16th, 1945, less than a month before it was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. So the bombs that they were developing during the Manhattan Project, they were planning to use the plutonium for a similar gun-type device, which is the uranium bomb, what ended up being the uranium bomb. When scientists realized almost exactly to the day a year before July 16th, 1945, that this was not going to be possible, that the science was not going to work, they had to find another design. So they had to develop a whole new type of bomb for the plutonium to be used, and that ended up being the Nagasaki bomb. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that northern New Mexico was, quote unquote, bombed, and it wasn't a full-scale bomb, but there were tests that were conducted through what was called the radioactive lanthanum tests. And these tests started in October of 1944, which means that by the time the Trinity bomb was actually tested, they had conducted about 36 atmospheric tests of radioactive lanthanum, which released, among other radioactive components, strontium-90. At the time in 1944, they had no way of tracing or detecting radiation, ionizing radiation, or fallout, and so we actually have no idea how much fallout really went into the atmosphere. So if you look at this map, when I talk about my grandparents and my great-grandparents, the community that I am from and that I grew up in and that my family is from is that community of El Rancho in the Poake Valley. This is not a topo map, obviously. This is looking and kind of thinking about the radioactive lanthanum tests, but that sort of X in the middle is Bio Canyon in Los Alamos, where those tests were conducted. And over the 19 years that they conducted these tests, they tested 232 radioactive lanthanum devices, essentially. So where does that put us in thinking about the beginning of the project to 2025? We know that the bombs, the only 2 times that nuclear weapons were used during a time of war, although that's arguable depending who you talk to, because many people would say that any time a nuclear weapon is used, including that about 1,000 atmospheric nuclear tests that the US conducted, these are also wartime events. But I say that because this comic was published in 2017 in the Albuquerque Journal, which is one of the local newspapers in New Mexico, showing what exists as this nuclear option. And of course, he was playing, John Trevor was playing on this sort of congressional nuclear option that I won't go into today. And there are a couple of inaccuracies there, but in general, I wanted to talk about what's on there. Starting with the top left, which is the Manhattan Project, that's the Los Alamos site. Down to the left, or down to the, I'll go counterclockwise, I guess, you have uranium mining. So in the 1950s, uranium was discovered in the Grants Uranium Belt, which is to say that the uranium for the nuclear bombs of 1945 was not taken from New Mexico, but it was ravaged in later years. We have almost 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation alone. Nuclear weapons storage is at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. Atomic bomb testing, that is the Trinity site in southern New Mexico, south central New Mexico. To the right of that, the low-level waste storage, that's actually inaccurate. That's the waste isolation pilot plant. So the way that the federal government classifies nuclear waste, low-level is one type of waste. Transuranic waste, which is high-level waste, is a different type. And that site is actually transuranic waste. There's major differences there. Uranium enrichment, we're the only place in the country that has what's called a uranium enrichment facility. That's URANCO. The spent uranium processing does not happen in New Mexico. In fact, the United States does not do spent fuel reprocessing. Temporary high-level waste storage. So right now there is a proposal, in fact, a license. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has licensed a facility for temporary high-level waste in New Mexico, which still hasn't started. And then those high-level waste deep borehole research projects were effectively shut down, but New Mexico has been sort of the target for a permanent repository for high-level waste in this country. A lot of people call this a cradle-to-grave nuclear industrial complex. I've gotten away, since I wrote my book, from using that language, and I could talk more about that later. But we effectively have a full-scale nuclear fuel chain, or fuel cycle, as some people call it. Additionally, we have weapons development. We have 2 of the nation's 3 nuclear weapons facilities in New Mexico, both Los Alamos National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratories. The weapons storage that I mentioned at Kirtland Air Force Base actually started as the Z Division in 1945. And by 1992, it was the largest nuclear waste storage facility in the United States. Many people and the researchers who look at the numbers of nuclear weapons that we have in this country say that based on the numbers, and of course this isn't like super public information, right, for a reason, if New Mexico were to secede from the country, we would be the 3rd largest nuclear wielding state in the world. We have, in addition to the Trinity site and the Rolla tests, other tests. There were 2 significant tests as part of the Plowshares or Atoms for Peace project, which was the Project Gas Buggy and Project Gnome, where they exploded weapons underground as a way to try to get oil and gas. You can imagine what happened there, right? Contamination, and it didn't work. And we have other types of waste, including lots of legacy waste from the Cold War period, high-level waste, dangerous nuclear waste, at sites like Area G in Los Alamos, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So these are images of the 2 facilities in New Mexico. I'm calling them facilities for a very particular reason, and I'll come back to that later, but they are laboratories. The federal government considers them national laboratories. The photo on the left is of Los Alamos in northern New Mexico, and the photo on the right is of Sandia in Albuquerque, or central New Mexico. And when we think about 80 years later, I'm going to fast forward that 80-ish years to talk about the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. So essentially at the beginning of every presidential administration, the new president has a nuclear posture review, which publishes a document that essentially gives the layout of the land on nuclear issues, nuclear weapons especially. And in 2018, when the Trump administration started when Trump started his first term, the beginning of that nuclear posture review was the language that says, the United States remains committed to its efforts in support of the ultimate global elimination of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And I'm not going to read the rest of that quote, but it's important to note that the official stance regarding nuclear weapons in this country today is one of deterrence, right? We have nuclear weapons so that other countries that have nuclear weapons will not use those weapons on us. And we know that deterrence works until it doesn't. And there are lots of problems with that idea of deterrence. But the important thing from this nuclear posture review to understand is that even after the United States says that it is committed to eliminating nuclear weapons, and what I like to say is ... a few pages later, they actually say that in order to do that, we're going to start producing a minimum of 80 new plutonium pits per year. Okay? So it says, the United States will pursue initiatives to ensure the necessary capability, capacity, and responsiveness of the nuclear weapons infrastructure and the needed skills of the workforce, including the following. provide the enduring capability and capacity to produce plutonium pits at a rate of no fewer than 80 pits per year by 2030. A delay in this would result in the need for a higher rate of pit production at a higher cost. How many of you know what a plutonium pit is? It's what I like to tell the middle schoolers is it's the part that makes the weapon go boom, the bomb go boom, right? It is the center or the trigger of a nuclear weapon. And when we think about nuclear weapons today, a nuclear weapon is not much bigger than the seat that you're sitting on. And to produce 80 new pits per year is a major increase in what's been done in recent years. So, and in fact, since the Manhattan Project. So up until the 1990s, plutonium pits were mostly produced in Colorado, right outside of Denver, in Arvada at Rocky Flats. And in the 1990s, the federal government raided that facility and shut it down for crimes against the environment. At that point, the only place that was capable of producing plutonium pits was Los Alamos, but not 80 pits per year, not even 30 pits per year. Right now, Los Alamos is being asked to produce 30 new, and these are like a new design, 30 new pits per year, which they don't have the capabilities to do. And Savannah River Site in South Carolina is being asked to produce 50 pits per year. Savannah River Site is not even operational right now. So what does this mean? It means that there's a major ramp up. There has been no clear cost analysis. The federal government doesn't even know how much this project is going to cost. And it's interesting to think about Trump's statements today, because he has said this recently, within the last year, he said this repeatedly, I should say, that he wants to get rid of nuclear weapons, right? And I think that part of the reason for that is the cost and the fact that they actually don't know how much this will cost. So what does that mean in 2025? The Trinity Downwinders have just recently been awarded, not awarded, but been included in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act reauthorization, which was attached to the big, beautiful bill in July of 2025. This creates major sort of cognitive dissonance when we're trying to cut all rural healthcare, which New Mexico is primarily rural, and also give compensation to downwinders who have gotten sick and have had generations of their family become ill because of that Trinity test in 1945. The other thing that's happening right now, today, is tritium venting, the radioactive tritium venting, or what they call depressurizing the flanged tritium waste containers in Los Alamos, in northern New Mexico at the lab. This was supposed to have been done in 2020. There were very important, significant environmental concerns and reasons why this did not happen in 2020. But the New Mexico Environment Department finally approved this, and the last container was vented today. So there are lots of concerns around this, and the last public meeting that was held concerning the tritium venting, which happened about 5 weeks ago, there were over 100 of us in attendance online alone, and another about 40 people in person. None of us who were online were even allowed to speak. So the concerns regarding no real-time transparency, vague, contradictory information, the thresholds for weather. So it's been raining a lot in New Mexico, which delayed the tritium venting. There are actually no thresholds that have been made publicly available about the weather, so how much rain will stop tritium venting, how much wind will stop tritium venting. Like, these are replications of what happened in the 1940s that ended up making people sick from the testing from the Trinity site and in Los Alamos. And then, of course, ignoring public and local community concerns. So that's all to say that one of the things that I'm really focused on right now is thinking about nuclear coloniality. We know that we're still in a nuclear colonial period. We are not post-colonial. Nuclear colonialism is ongoing. But I'm very concerned with the way that the nuclear industrial complex has affected things like culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production, especially in New Mexico. And so to end, I want to just introduce this and then come back to it hopefully in Q&A. So I just recently got back from Japan. I was lucky enough to accompany the delegation of pilgrims that went to Japan for the 80th anniversary. We had 8 American institutions that were involved. We had about 36 university students like yourselves that were there. And this is just to say that recently the New Mexico or Archdiocese of Santa Fe, that's our Archbishop Wester, right in the middle. This is Archbishop Emeritus Takami. This is Archbishop Nakamura, Archbishop Etani of Seattle, and then one of the bishops in Japan, and I'm forgetting his name at the moment. But they have formed this partnership for peace in thinking about the role of the Catholic Church for nuclear abolition, like abolition, capital A, right? We are talking abolition here. And this sign on the right comes from the quote comes from Pope Francis. That sign is placed right as people start ascending the hill to Los Alamos on their way to work. It's placed right outside of my home community, and it says the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral. And so the question that I kind of just want to end this piece with right now is, what is the role of the Catholic Church in nuclear weapons abolition work? And one of the things that I've been pushing for 2 years is that, yes, maybe this will work, and if the Catholic Church, especially in New Mexico, wants to take this position, we need to also address the very first period of colonialism, which was Spanish colonialism in New Mexico, in the New World, in the Americas, that ushered in the same Catholicism, because this period of nuclear colonialism is only possible because of that first period of Spanish colonialism in New Mexico. So I'm going to end there, and then hopefully we'll have more time for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariah. Next, we'll have Amanda Nichols take the podium. She is an independent scholar who works as a production editor for Equinox Publishing and also serves as the managing editor for the Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. She's the author of several peer-reviewed articles, as well as a United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research report, which she co-authored with Mary Olson, entitled Gender and Ionizing Radiation Towards a New Research Agenda Addressing Disproportionate Harm. She's also the co-editor of a volume of collected essays on the global legacies of anti-nuclear activism, which is currently under review with McGill Queen's University Press. Welcome, Amanda.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin this afternoon just by thanking everyone who made this event possible today. So a special thanks is due to Thomas Landy and the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture for supporting and hosting this event, and to Ruby Francis for helping to coordinate everything for our visit. I would also like to extend my very heartfelt thanks to my dear friend Jacques Linder for both envisioning and organizing this event and gathering us all here today, and to thank my co-panelists Ray and Mariah, who I look forward to being in conversation with, and to all of you for joining us today. So I'm honored to be here to speak with you, and I look forward to talking with you after in the Q&A. These well-known images of the mushroom clouds from the US bombings of Hiroshima on the left and Nagasaki on the right on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, respectively, are visceral visual reminders of the violent capacities of nuclear weapons. When I set out to think about the framing question that Jacques posed for this panel, how do you think about nuclear weapons 80 years after the bombings, I immediately recalled these two images. More specifically, I recalled the words that I have heard a mentor of mine say many times to describe these images. It is a mistake, she says, to say that these photos are of a bomb. These clouds are what was, moments before, buildings, trees, homes, girls and boys, women and men. Much of my research since completing my PhD has focused on drawing out the otherwise unseen, invisible dangers of nuclear weapons, such as the immediate death of hundreds of thousands of civilians and the suffering of countless others, which is represented in these images of a mushroom cloud. The dangers of nuclear weapons are often minimized, they're often suppressed, and even intentionally left out of the stories that we tell about our nuclear technologies. Even more importantly, however, is these invisible dangers continue to inform our nuclear politics today, influencing the things that we think about, the ways that we regulate, govern, and imagine our nuclear futures. So today I want to spend a little bit of time focusing specifically on one invisible danger of nuclear weapons, which is ionizing radiation, which is the one that I work on most closely. Much of my recent work has been focused specifically on illuminating the disproportionate and transgenerational consequences of human exposure to ionizing radiation. And I know that some of you may not be familiar with those terms, so I will unpack them for you here today. When detonated, nuclear weapons release a massive amount of energy. This energy is the result of the instantaneous decay of billions of radioactive atomic nuclei. Though the detonations themselves are extremely visible, as we can see in the images of the mushroom bomb that I just showed, the waves of energy, those gamma waves that are produced, and the high energy particles, the alpha and beta particles that are emitted as part of that radioactive decay process, which are commonly referred to as ionizing radiation, is completely invisible. Therefore, it is possible to be impacted by ionizing radiation, as so many communities around the world have been, without ever knowing that they have been contaminated. Ionizing radiation can harm the body in two ways. First, in large amounts, it can destroy the cells through immediate physical impacts and effects such as radiation burns or acute radiation syndrome. These harms are very evident in cases of high levels of radiation exposure, such as those that occur in the aftermath of a nuclear detonation, like those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Second, ionizing radiation, including at very low levels, may cause damage and mutations to the DNA, which is really important for what I will talk about at the end of this presentation. If that damage is not repaired by the cell, it can and often does result in a number of health consequences, including things like infertility, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and genetic impacts. Although these effects can, in some cases, appear really soon after the exposure, in most cases, they are not observed until many years later. For decades, exposure to ionizing radiation has been understood as having a uniform effect on exposed populations, meaning that all exposed individuals would have similar health consequences at the same dose or exposure rate. However, in 2006, we get data that is published in a report called the Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation 7, or as I will refer to it, the Beer 7 report, that showed evidence of disproportionate harm in women and children. The data that was reported in the Beer 7 report comes from the Lifespan Study, which is a long-term longitudinal research study that is still ongoing, which has collected data from the survivors of the bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki since 1950, and importantly, it has done so without their consent. Now, it is also important to know that although the Beer 7 report provides this data and shows the numbers for it, that women are more harmed from nuclear bombs, it does not draw any conclusions whatsoever about that data, nor does it pose any kind of follow-up questions. It is simply a report and from the data that is gathered in the LSS. In 2011, after reviewing that data and crunching the numbers, a mentor that I have worked closely with for the last 7 years, named Mary Olson, published a briefing report entitled "Atomic Radiation is More Harmful to Women." In it, she drew the data from the Beer 7 report and showed that women are disproportionately impacted by exposure to ionizing radiation. Her research was later published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal in 2019. So in the graph that you see here, each bar shows the rate of cancer per 100,000 individuals adjusted to a scenario where everyone got the exact same radiation exposure. The orange bars are females, and the blue star bars represent males. And then across the bottom, you see the ages that the survivors were in August 1945 when they were exposed to the atomic detonation, with those who were infants are on the left, and then those who were the elders at that time are on the right. So this rendering of the data really helps us to see more clearly that both age and sex are factors in radiation harm. It's easy to see here that females suffered more cancers than males in every single age group, and the difference in that exposure is greatest when it is in childhood. So the finding about disproportionate impact was groundbreaking, and it informed negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN during the mid-2010s. The disproportionate impact of indiscriminate nuclear weapons is now reflected in both the preamble and the provision for victims' assistance in that treaty, which went into effect in January 2021 after it was ratified by the required 50th nation state. So in early 2023, Olson was contacted by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, or UNIDIR, and asked if she would provide an update on her previous research on disproportionate impact. They were doing a big study. They wanted updated research. So she and I had been working together closely for about 6 years at that point, and she knew that my recent research was directly aligned with this project, and so she brought me on as a collaborator, and then eventually over the course of the next 18 months of the research that we did, as the principal investigator and the primary author of the report. So together we have now presented this about 5 or 6 times at different UN events, including at the 3rd meeting of states parties that was held in March at the for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in New York. And our report assessed whether there has been any additional research whatsoever since the Beer 7 report that has been conducted to either verify, engage, or refine the findings that showed that girls and women are disproportionately harmed. And so what we found, I actually didn't think that we were going to find very much, but we actually found quite a lot. What we found was robust additional evidence that ionizing radiation exposure causes more cancer, more heart disease, and more stroke in women compared to men over the course of their lifetimes. We also found that biological sex and age at time of exposure are independent but compounding factors in radiation harm. This means that both biological sex and age at the time of exposure can independently affect the outcomes from harm, but when they are combined, those impacts are not just doubled, they are compounded by an exponential factor. So some adult cancers, we know, are the result of exposures that happened in childhood. This makes the adult population really complex in terms of the radiation risk profile, because early exposures also compound with any exposure that then happens later in life, putting the exposed individuals at an even greater risk of negative health consequences. We also know now that little girls, when exposed early, between birth and 5 years old, are the most at risk over the course of their lifetime for developing cancer and non-cancer related health consequences. So, why are biological sex and age factors in the outcomes of radiation exposure? The short answer is that we have no idea yet. What we do know, however, is that females are more at risk of developing cancer and non-cancer related disease outcomes from radiation exposure across all age groups. We also know that exposure to radiation in one life stage impacts all post-exposure life stages, and the research clearly indicates that radiation exposure in childhood is most harmful. This is critical because our species, like others, is a species that has a life cycle that repeats over time, forming our generations. So each life stage is dependent on and emerges from the one that precedes it. So in my research, most of my recent research, I talk about the transgenerational impacts of nuclear weapons, by which I mean the long-term genetic consequences of radiation exposure across multiple generations and well into the future. You can see in the pictograph above the differences between inter, multi, and transgenerational, just so you have an idea about what those are. So intergenerational and multi-generational forms of harm are explicit in radiation exposure data. We do not yet have great evidence of transgenerational exposure because it has only been 80 years since the bomb. Yet despite the evidence that does exist, these harms have not been widely addressed or discussed in the context of exposure at different life stages. One of the most important questions that arises from this new study that we've done, which takes seriously the compounding and life cycle impacts, is the question of transgenerational impacts of radiation harm. What the data shows us is that we need a more nuanced understanding of the effects of radiological harm in general. Transgenerational approaches are needed so that we can better understand how exposure affects us as individuals and from one generation to the next, as well as how it affects us across generations well into the future. We fool ourselves into believing that the study of impacts in an adult population, which is often represented as being composed solely of adult males, can tell the whole story of health consequences. Current models for radiological protections in the United States are still based on a model called reference man, which is a model that was designed in 1974 that is defined as a 20 to 30-year-old male who is approximately 154 pounds and 5 feet 6 inches tall, and it specifies that he is white. Yet the radiation data shows that children, particularly girls, are the most harmed life stage. So unless protections are centered here, then we have not adequately protected those individuals in the population that are the most vulnerable. And we are failing to protect the generations of children and grandchildren that will come after them. So we cannot therefore continue to look at an adult-only population model, and this is what some of my ongoing future research is looking at. If we want to fully understand the ways that radiation impacts us and the future of our species, we must create a life cycle model. So this is what we are sort of calling for. And I believe that this needs to be the new standard for quality radiation research and regulatory policy concerning the continued proliferation and use of indiscriminate nuclear weapons. So when I think about nuclear weapons today, I think about the victims and survivors of nuclear atrocities, like the US bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I also think about the countless generations of girls and women, those living today and those who will come after us, who are often rendered invisible by our current radiation policies, who will bear the brunt of the health consequences of our radioactive nuclear weapons legacies without ever knowing the cause. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amanda. And then finally, for our last initial section, we have Ray Atchison. Ray Atchison is an organizer, activist, and writer. They are the director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the world's oldest feminist peace organization. They served from 2008 to 2024 on the steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work to ban nuclear weapons. Ray provides analysis and advocacy at the United Nations on matters of nuclear disarmament, autonomous weapons, the arms trade, military spending, and more. Ray is the author of Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, which came out in 2021, as well as Abolishing State Violence, A World Beyond Bombs, Borders, and Cages, which came out in 2022. Welcome, Ray.
Thank Thank you. I feel that Amanda's thanks were very comprehensive, so I'm just going to echo that and not repeat it. So thank you, Amanda, for doing that work. When Jacques asked how we're thinking about nuclear weapons 80 years on after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, really the way that I'm thinking about it is in the context of fascism, and how fascism is coming back strong 80 years on. And the alleged justification for the creation of nuclear weapons in the first place, back in the 1940s, was to end a war against fascism. It was to end the Nazis, right? Originally, the bomb was supposed to be used against Germany. But 80 years later, we have both Nazis and nuclear weapons. And this is the world that we're living in now. And so how I'm thinking about nuclear weapons is really as weapons of fascism, as fascist weapons. They're weapons that are designed to incite terror. They're weapons for mass destruction. They're meant to intimidate adversaries and allies both into submission and put everybody under control. And they're also weapons of colonialism and racism. And from, if we look at, uranium mining, the sort of digging up from the earth the ingredients that go into nuclear weapons, to their development and their testing, to the storage then of radioactive waste at the end of it all of this has been imposed around the world primarily upon indigenous lands and waters and peoples without the consent of people or other relations living there. Nuclear colonialism has led to what scholar Mike Davis described as a poisoned terminal landscape. And he was talking about the United States, but that could apply to the entire world. The US today still, of course, has one of the largest nuclear arsenals on the planet. It's rivaled only by Russia. Its above-ground nuclear detonations have stopped for now, but the US continues to invest billions of dollars a year into quote-unquote modernizing nuclear weapons, which is euphemism for building more nuclear weapons, new types of nuclear weapons, extending their life into the future so that they can be maintained for another 80 years more, right? The missile silos that are spread across the United States Midwest, the expanding labs in New Mexico that we heard about, and South Carolina, the leaking toxic plutonium plant in Washington State, which is closed, but where they produced all the plutonium for the bombs, the ongoing subcritical tests that they still do in Nevada, all of these and so many more aspects have really shrouded the land and water with radiation and contamination, and that's just in the United States itself. There's also the leaking dome of US nuclear waste in the Marshall Islands, right? They scooped up all the radiation from the testing in the Pacific, they poured a bunch of concrete over it, and they left it to rot in the ocean. And that is leaking and cracking because of climate change, and people there having to contend with that with no help from the US. There's also what other nuclear-armed states have done, right? So there's the fallout from the French nuclear testing that's still impacting communities across the Pacific and in Algeria. There's still impacts happening from the UK testing in Australia, which is also where a lot of uranium comes from still. Testing from Russia inside of Kazakhstan, et cetera, et cetera. So we could go on and on about this. But I think the main point in this framing of nuclear weapons as colonial, as fascist, it's really about bodies being disposable. And in the nuclear age, bodies are disposable. Certain bodies are disposable. And this theme really spreads across the threads of horror that are being woven by fascism today, particularly bodies that are deemed unworthy, unnatural, unwelcome, right? So in this country, immigrants, trans and queer folks, pregnant people, Black and Latinx folks, and the list goes on and on and on. And so a big part of my work and my interests is really connecting these threads of fascism, or even more broadly, state violence, right? Because state violence exists both with and without a fascist government. So I'm talking here about prisons, police, borders, all of these different elements of violence and control Each of them actually has a relationship with nuclear weapons. Sometimes it's material, sometimes it's philosophical. But I think it's really important to dig into these because it also means that our movements against any of these structures can also be related, and we can work together to abolish these institutions of state violence. So I want to dig into this a little bit more, and Jacques, please feel free to throw something at me when I'm going over. If we're looking at prisons as an example, nuclear weapon facilities are usually situated within communities where they're sold as job creators, right? They're going to be good for the local economy. Lionel says that all the time, right? And it's the exact same with the prisons and the detention centers that we see going up now, even though countless economic studies show how untrue this is. Companies that make nuclear weapons also generally make other weapons, which can be acquired not just by the military, but also by police, often for free. And police are receiving military training to use military weapons. So I don't know if any of you are aware of the cop cities that have been spreading around the country, starting in Atlanta. Now there's over 70 in development around the US that we know of. And so there's relationships between policing and nuclear weapons in terms of these companies and the technologies that they're having access to, even if it's not nuclear itself. Philosophically, also, I think there's a similarity in the way that nuclear weapons cage our imaginations, right? Just like ideas around policing and prisons can do. So we're taught that we really can't imagine security without these structures. If we start talking about dismantling them, whether it's nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, or whether it's policing in prisons, we're often told, well, what would you do instead? How would you provide safety for communities, et cetera? When in reality, neither of these things actually provide safety for any communities. They provide profits for the people that build them, the people that work in them, et cetera. And there's a great quote by Angela Davis about prisons that I think really applies to nuclear weapons. She says that there is widespread reluctance to face the realities that are hidden within prisons, a fear of thinking about what happens inside them. Thus, the prison is present in our lives, and at the same time, it is absent from our lives. The same is really true about nuclear weapons if we start thinking about them. Many people accept the argument that there's some kind of necessary evil for this deterrence project that Mariah was talking about, and we don't really examine the harms that actually these weapons create that we've heard a lot about already today. The bombs are out of sight and out of mind for most people, except those that are being actively harmed by them or that have a legacy of harm. And so the questions in both these cases are whose security are nuclear weapons or prisons policing serving? Against what or whom do they offer protection? Borders is the other one I just wanted to quickly dig into a little bit as well. So the global battlescape of border security is also intimately connected to nuclear weapons. Again, they're both about maintaining systems of hierarchy and inequality in a philosophical sense. The concept of deterrence is also applicable to both migration and nuclear weapons, and both leading to extreme harms for people that are experiencing these policies of deterrence. This idea of a state of exception that borders are increasingly turned into, where you have less rights, especially if you're not a citizen of the country that you're entering, where people can be left to die in the desert or at sea in order to protect the destination country. And so nuclear weapons are also treated as a state of exception, right? It's treated as rational and necessary somehow to protect countries by possessing the capacity to commit genocide and even global annihilation. So along with these philosophical connections, again, there's the material connections. Some of the companies that are involved in developing the militarized technology for border control are nuclear weapon companies. So for example, Leonardo, which is an Italian arms company, it makes drones for the EU Coast Guard, and it makes nuclear missiles for France. Thales, a Dutch company, also makes nuclear missiles and border surveillance infrastructure for Europe and the EU. A classic example here in the US is that Sandia National Lab, one of the nuclear weapon labs in New Mexico, actually designed the initial iteration of the militarization of the US-Mexico border back in the 1990s. And Sandia used to be run by AT&T and then Lockheed Martin and now Honeywell. And so there's connections between all these companies and nuclear weapons as well. So these are just two quick examples. I could go into this much more, but I think the point that I want to get to now to close is really about the ways that our movements have to be connected because of this as well. They provide us with, and not to use militarized language, but with targets, right? With companies that we can go after, and with arguments that we can engage with in discourse. What are the shared economic and political arguments that are used to justify any of these structures? What are the educational materials and community organizing that we can do to confront each of these sites of violence? What are the companies that are profiting from all of these? The weapon contractors, the private military companies, construction companies, banks, financial institutions. A lot of them are really tied up together in many different ways. And they also connect transnationally, right? Some of these companies have sites not just in the United States, but in other locations around the world. And so what divestment and boycott campaigns can we collaborate on? We have a lot of different ways to approach these companies from the nuclear weapon angle, from the immigration angle, from the incarceration or policing angle, surveillance, borders, et cetera. And they can all be connected. And I think, I drew a lot of inspiration from the student encampments that were happening last year and from the other ongoing divestment work in relation to stopping arms transfers to Israel and ending the genocide. And there's a lot of work that's been done to connect that to a broader movement against the military-industrial complex, which in this country, because the nuclear weapon contractors are also making the conventional weapons that are being sent to Israel, it makes them a common target for all of us. So that's where I just want to end today before we move into Q&A, is the bleakness of this time can feel very overwhelming. And I think where I really look for the inspiration to keep doing this work is that there are so many people that are fighting back, that are resisting, and the more that we can connect with each other, no matter what issue we are working on, we are all in this together and can work together more effectively. Thanks.